Hey guys, it's Gary. Sunday night. Kind of tired, to be honest with you. And I shouldn't be, because I've had almost 2 full days off from the training. Monday through Friday last week, new job, training. Was supposed to go in for a 6th day on Saturday, which was yesterday. But the company couldn't coordinate it. So they didn't have enough people to do training one-on-one, which is what the point that I'm at now. So I went in knowing that they would send me home, but I made a showing anyway. So they sent me home yesterday, Saturday morning. I have today off. I was supposed to work tomorrow, but they still don't have it together. So they're going to call me and let me know. I've already got an appointment on Tuesday that I know of. The worst thing with this training is it's not the training so far. Well, last week was in two different parts of New Jersey, not near here, not near where I live, which might not be bad if it weren't for the fact that of the top 4 or 5 worst cities in New Jersey, crime-wise, and just these cities are decimated. These buildings and slums and then crime and everything. Of the top 5 worst cities in New Jersey, I've got training in 3 of them. These are places you don't want to go to. That's where the company sets up its large-scale training facility coordination. It's awful. To have 2 of them under my belt, but one of the really bad cities that I have to go to, I still have to go to on Tuesday. Hopefully that'll be it for a while. And it's weird because, now it's Sunday night, and yet I'm really feeling tired. Just getting out of the, and it's not, I haven't done anything physical at all yet, which I will be. But just trying to get into a schedule has been hard for me. For some reason, for years, whenever I'm not working, which is, been about the last year, but really not prior to that. But even at my last job, when I was able to make my own hours, for some reason it was easier for me to sleep during the day. I don't know why. So I would sleep fairly early in the night and get up, 2 in the morning, 1 in the morning, and I was able to actually go into work and start then. My body just doesn't want to sleep much at night. Or if it does, I'm tired, I fall asleep for a few hours, and then I'm up. Whatever. So it's early evening now, and I'm tired, but I can guarantee you when I go to sleep, I won't stay asleep. Tomorrow, basically, I got to sit at home, not having a cell phone, and wait for the company to call and let me know what the arrangements are for Wednesday going forward, because on Tuesday I have an appointment to go to, a training appointment in one of the worst cities in New Jersey, again, a different one than I've been to in last week. Anyway, so that's an update. I've spent too long talking about that. But it's been very nice, all the support that I've gotten, all the people that said nice supportive things to me and actually were interested in what's going on with me. Today I decided to do this while I could. I was going to hold off and try to do it tomorrow, but you never know what tomorrow might hold. And after that, once again, it's a whirlwind of activity, and I know for sure I'll be working on weekends as well, starting this coming weekend off from then on, definitely. I would like to say this is the first in a series, but it probably will be the only one like this that I will do. And that is because memory doesn't serve me. What this is basically, I only have a few discs to show here. And musically, they don't really have anything in common. What is interesting with them is how I discovered them. And back in the very early 80s, around 1982, 83, starting at that period, I was unemployed at that time for a while. And Even before I became unemployed, though, I discovered an NPR, National Public Radio, affiliate station in New York City, which is still there, WNYC, huge station. And they had various music programs, as well as political programs and talk shows and all that kind of thing. At the time that I discovered them through a nightly music program that they had that would go on every night, 7 nights a week at 11 p.m. and go to midnight. It was called New Sounds, and I discovered a lot of music through New Sounds. Program's still going today with its original host. Started in the early 80s. Great show. And it's syndicated to NPR stations, so and they seem to, even though it originates from New York, it is syndicated and available to all NPR stations. So anybody who may listen to NPR that's a music fanatic, especially of interesting and unusual, serious music, you might want to check out a program called New Sounds. It's on 7 nights a week for an hour. It's pre-recorded. It's recorded generally in the afternoons, I know. But it's made available to all NPR stations, and incredible array of music they play. Introduced me to a lot of artists and a lot of music. They have an archive, too, of stuff. I will try to remember the link for the radio station and for the New Sounds archive so anybody can hear them and play them, now that I think about it. It was just a few years ago that, I'm used to listening to them in real time on the radio. I used to, when I was working even, I worked at night, I used to tune them in at my job. It's in recent years, I forgot that they actually have an archive of a lot of their shows from years ago. Very interesting stuff. A lot of oriented toward kind of avant-garde classical and jazz music, I would say. And maybe some skirting along the edge of avant-garde post-rock stuff sometimes. But I will try to find the link. I haven't listened to shows on there for a while. And put it in the message. Look at the messages for it, and you could get a taste of it and kind of... the show did have a searchable database. Where you can enter an artist's name and maybe look up to see if they played some music from that artist on a specific show. But I would say if I find the link and I do... I'm able to put it in there. The stuff that's by artists that you don't know is probably the best stuff because you discover new things. So I would say just any archive show that you can hit on, just click on it, and listen. Sometimes they have live performances in the studio, so that particular show naturally is oriented toward that particular artist. But in general, it's usually just playing recorded music. They always give plenty of examples of, the artist, the name of the album, so that if you're hearing something you like, it's pretty easy to jot it down and find it. So I'm going to try to include the link for New Sounds. It's an incredible show. It's not new age, synth-oriented at all. They do play some synthesizer music, but incredible stuff, far-reaching stuff even beyond my comprehension. But as a result of discovering that show, on that I discovered the whole station. I stumbled across that show one night for years and years, and actually still is on 11 p.m. to 12 a.m. I discovered a new station, so I stuck around on the station to see what other programming they had. Like I said, news. There's some news-oriented stuff. But every night, back in the early 80s, it's not something they do now. Though back in the early 80s, they had, after midnight, after the New Sounds program ended, they had a show that was roughly a classical music show that ran from midnight until about 6 a.m. The good thing with it was it wasn't tightly formatted. And being an NPR station, there was no commercials. So there was never a commercial break. They very, 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 very frequently played entire albums. This is the vinyl era, guys. This is before CDs. So the interesting thing was, if they played an entire album, you would hear side one, and then there would be this break where the radio just went silent for 10, 15, 20 seconds until the DJ could physically flip the record over and play side 2, which was really great. He wouldn't come on the air between side 1 and 2. There was just this audible silence for, however long it physically takes to go to a turntable and flip the record over. Very interesting to hear that. And you could tell, if you were listening real closely, even if it was very quiet music, you would hear this, all of a sudden you wouldn't hear the vinyl sound anymore. Little clicks and pops or whatever weren't there. And then all of a sudden you would hear, about 15 seconds later, so the music would start again. I discovered a lot of music through there. I don't really know much about classical music anyway. They played a lot of classical music, but it wasn't the top of the pops. I don't think you would ever hear the Four Seasons, Vivaldi, or really much Beethoven or anything like that there. They specialized in a lot of avant-garde classical music. That realm of music, though, also went toward other things that weren't quite classical music, but were almost unclassifiable. So they might play some world music, but nothing, oddly enough, nothing rhythmic, nothing easy to grasp a hold of. And I used to listen to the show like it was. I used to listen to this program, 6 hours a night, like it was a television show. I looked forward to it every night, and it was on 7 nights a week. What am I going to hear now? Especially at the time I wasn't working. I was still living at home, with my parents, and living off the few $100s I had saved, whatever. But listening to this music, and I would often stare out the window at the dark, dark, dark street below. And it was kind of an odd time, in my life. But by the same token, that experience of listening to the music in the just the absolute pitch, 2, 3, 4 in the morning, especially on weekdays when everybody's asleep, kind of gazing out the window, looking at the stars in the sky, looking down at the street lights. The street was dead, maybe once an hour a car would go by, because this was a small suburban street that I lived on, so not a lot of people driving by even. And the music, because so much of the music was fairly abstract, it made the whole thing a surreal experience. It was almost like you didn't need to take drugs. It was almost like taking a drug trip. It was a very surreal experience. Listening to this music, especially the more avant-garde and experimental the music was, the more surrealistic the experience came of hearing this late at night like that. It was a very interesting time. Excuse me for a minute. Oh, that's better. And there's only a few specific albums that I recall discovering at this time. And by the way, the DJ was excellent. It was a guy who I can't find any trace of on the internet anywhere. His name was Stan David, was the DJ. There was another guy named Bill Slater who was basically the guy that filled in when Stan David wasn't there, because Stan David didn't work 7 nights a week. It probably worked 5. But I've never been able to find anything out about this guy Stan David, who I think even at that time was probably an older guy. Perfect for this show because he had this slow, mellow way of speaking and voice. Hold on a second, I got to change the disc here. And he had a soft, kind of deep, mellow voice and way of speaking, and he was obvious. I know he was live in the studio. He was the guy spinning the records. And hold on a second while I turn down the volume. And you could tell that this guy was very aware of the fact that he was broadcasting in the dead of night. You would never hear a DJ speak that softly and quietly during any radio broadcast during the daytime, even if it was a classical music station. So his approach, unlike most DJs, that playing this sometimes quiet or abstract classical music, and all of a sudden the DJ would come on. It might be a bit of a shock, but man, this guy knew who his audience was. He was very well aware that the music was, in a lot of cases, very abstract and very quiet and very atmospheric. And so when he came on, he just locked in with that mood, and it was a really cool experience. And at one time, I had made a whole stack of cassette tapes of his broadcasts. I could listen to the guy read a telephone book. I mean, I love listening to him speak, and I love the music, and there was no commercials, so there was nothing not to love about this show that went on for about 6 hours a night. And I had a stack of cassette tapes that I recorded over the years, and of course I left them in my old house when I moved, and the old house was sold and actually knocked down. And I was debating whether or not to take them. Naturally, I should have, but there's a lot of things I should have taken that I just don't have space for where I live now. And I just kept on putting it off, and then it got to the point that I wasn't making trips back to the house anymore, and the house got sold, and once that paper's signed and the new owner has it, I can't go in there and, take shit, or actually, no, the house actually did get cleaned out beforehand. So once those people came, they took everything from inside, including my cassette tapes, and took those. And I'm probably sorry I didn't keep them now, but I just don't have the space. But I had some examples of radio broadcasts, and this is all about 3 years ago when I moved. And I was hoping that at some point on the internet I could find. The radio station themselves doesn't have an archive like that they put up of those shows. I was kind of hoping that maybe there was another crazy listener like me that enjoyed the show so much that they put up, some broadcasts from cassette or whatever of the show. But I've never been able to see that. Turn that down a little bit. The show was called. It was their overnight program. I don't know if it had a real formal title, but. I seem to recall him referring to it as While the City Sleeps. Fitting name. And I can only recall about 3 specific albums that I heard on this program. But they were one of those kind of pinpoint milestone things where everything's in sync, the music was perfectly aligned to the mood of the evening, and I'm staring out the window and everything. And actually, all of these, my first hearing of them was from this radio show. Now, oddly enough, I don't actually have the actual albums they played, but I remembered a couple of titles of some of the pieces, and I ended up picking up albums that were almost what I heard. And I'll show you, for instance. One night they played something I had never heard of before by a composer, Charles Dodge, who's still alive, still around, an early experimental electronics composer. I'd never heard of him or his album before. And they played this piece called Earth's Magnetic Field, which is fairly well known if you're into the early days of serious electronic music, not pop electronic music. Or New Age electronic music, but rather the real serious stuff that was coming out of places like Princeton and places like that. And I recall hearing Earth's Magnetic Field, which was a piece from 1970, and they played the whole album. Now, at the time, this is before the internet, guys. I couldn't find the album in stores, and the fact is it was probably out of print at that point. So it was only years later that I found this particular CD, which I recommend highly, called the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center, 1961 to 1973. This is not going to focus unless I make it. There we go. It's not specifically a Charles Dodge album. It is various composers that worked out of the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center during those years. Ingram Marshall, etc., Alice Shields, Charles Dodge. This was the only place I was able to find Earth's Magnetic Field. However, when they played Earth's Magnetic Field on the radio, I recall it being they played the entire album, and I recall it being a very long piece, and I recall that break, as I mentioned earlier, of the one side ending, and you have this silence on the radio for like 15 or 20 seconds while they flip it over and play the other side. When I got this, I was a little disappointed because it's like, well, that's much shorter than what I heard. There's 14 minutes of Earth's Magnetic Field on here, and I know for a fact I heard much longer. Now, it was only when Discogs came around that I was able to actually find the original album by Charles Dodge, which apparently was never re-released on CD. So the album came out on vinyl. Earth's Magnetic Field is the only piece on the album. Yet the album's only 29 minutes long. It's 14 minutes on one side and 15 minutes on the other. And since the piece on here is 14 minutes, I'm going to assume that they just basically took probably side one, of the piece and didn't include the whole thing, but included half of the album. I certainly knew it was longer than 14 minutes because I seem to recall sitting there listening to it for quite a long time. And actually, if you heard it in the background, the 14-minute excerpt that's on here was what I was playing when at the beginning of the video. It's an interesting piece. It's the synthesizer pretty much sounds like a monophonic synthesizer, so there's not chords, there's not a lot going on. But you have to kind of relate it back to my head in the early, when I heard it in the early 80s, it was only about a dozen years old at that point. Synthesizers certainly had come a long way even at that point, and it did sound like early music, early synthesizer music at that point. But still, just that whole experience of listening to this thing, hearing this thing at 3 o'clock in the morning, and they play the whole album. And it was only recently that I actually found, like I said, the whole album is just the piece Earth's Magnetic Field by Charles Dodge. Apparently has not yet, if ever, been released on CD. And the record's long out of print. So the only place to really hear at least half of it was on this Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center album. So I'm glad I have this. The other pieces are fine as well. But, when I do play that 14-minute excerpt, I am, pining away for the rest of it, which may or may not ever see the light of day. I hope it does eventually on a reissue of Charles Dodge's own. But I don't know if it hasn't come yet. And I didn't pull it, but I've got an album of his, of other pieces of his. But this is, Earth's Magnetic Field is not on that. I'm hoping that he, can get the rights to it and release it on some kind of chronological compilation thing or something someday. But hey, half of it's on Columbia Princeton album. And it was just one of those things that, none of the things I'm going to show here are albums that I can play without recalling that first time that I heard them. And that overnight thing and that dreamy, surrealistic thing of, looking out the window in the night and hearing this incredibly abstract music. Another one that I heard, I was already familiar with the artist, but I had not heard the album. The problem is, it's one of two albums, and I can't be sure which one I heard. So I pulled them both. One night, and once again they played the whole album, vinyl, in the vinyl age, in the early 80s. Played the album, turned it over, played the other side. And that was one of these two. Pretty avant-garde stuff, too, at the time. From these guys. You don't necessarily think of Paul Bley, the late, great Paul Bley. So here's my little semi-tribute to him, because he just passed away a week ago. About 7 days ago. I can't be sure. Sometimes I think it was the Pyramid album that I heard. Other times I think it was the Quiet Song album. I knew it was an album on this label from this time. This is Paul Bley's own label originally, the IAI label, Independent Artists label that was run and owned by Paul Bley. and I heard the album, Paul Bly, Bill Connors, and it was either Lee Conant's from the Pyramid album, or Jimmy Guthrie from the Quiet Song album. They're both very similar. They're both pretty much largely, if not entirely, improvised. And now Lee Konitz and Jimmy Guthrie both aren't really known for avant-garde music. This is one of the more outside things, kind of experimental freeform things that they've done. Paul Bly either, really. He's a fan of unusual chord sequences, and his playing I describe sometimes as very, very intentionally tart and angular, but not incredibly avant-garde. And Bill Connors, regardless of whether he's playing fusion music or acoustic music, also not incredibly avant-garde. And yet, for all four of the various people involved in these two albums, it's pretty out there stuff for them. Like I said, fairly experimental. I'm not sure. Sometimes I think it was this album that I heard, Quiet Song album, and they're recorded not far apart from each other, and they both have that kind of avant-garde freeform thing to it. And then other times I think it was the Pyramid album, which I love this cover, very early 70s-ish and even late 60s. Because then I think I also heard recall the DJ mentioning Lee Konitz's name, and Lee Konitz played on Pyramid and not on Quiet Song. I can't be sure which one I heard, but this is pretty out there stuff, pretty avant-garde, abstract, very abstract stuff for these guys, amongst the most abstract things that any of them have done. Perfectly suited for 2 or 3 in the morning, which is when I heard it. Now, at the time, I was discovering mainstream jazz. I don't know if I heard Konitz or Guthrie at that point. I didn't know who Paul Bly was. I didn't know who Bill Connors was, because I was already an ECM fanatic at that point. But I didn't have either one of these two albums by them. I was just starting my collection. So even I was surprised when I heard these albums. And I think it was, like I said, maybe it was Pyramid. I think maybe it was Pyramid that I heard. And not a long album. Both these albums were under 40 minutes. But like I said, pretty out there for these guys. Pretty out there stuff. And certainly an abstract-y thing that suits those late night hours. It's weird that I can't remember the specific album it was. Got a lot of flashing from the TV going on there. The other album I remembered, and this was really the most I would say of all of them, this one stands out the most, but maybe that's hard to say. These three really stand out, and there were hundreds and hundreds of other nights when I listened to this show, and hundreds of other albums that I had this experience with, and yet, for whatever reason, these three stood out. And maybe it's because, maybe it's only because this is, the ones that I recalled specifically, and when I eventually purchased them, I recalled exactly where I first heard them. So many of my buys of albums are blind buys, and maybe 20 years after I heard something on this overnight program, I might have picked up an album, but never actually recalled that I heard it on the overnight program. And I wish, in a way, I wish there were program lists of the shows, just a breakdown of what they played on any given night back then. So I could go back and take a look and see how many of these albums did I actually end up with, that I actually heard on this program the first time, and ended up picking up years later without realizing that I had heard them on this program. The ones that I'm showing here are just the ones that I know for a fact, and I recall hearing them and listening to them, and then going out and seeking out the albums, even though years later, because by the time I picked up Charles Dodge on here, the CD era had started, and that was several years after I heard it, 5, 6, 7 years later, after hearing them on the radio. I heard all of these on vinyl. You know, these are the original vinyl era. I'm not sure. I thought I had these on vinyl, the two Paul Bley and Bill Connors albums, but I never turned them up. So I'm thinking maybe I didn't, you know, and it took until the late 80s for me to actually pick them up. And yet I recall very, very specifically, well, because actually somewhere, I actually had the broadcast of the Paul Bley and Bill Connors album on a cassette tape somewhere. I think that one got lost even before I moved. The only other album I recall hearing, and this was very surrealistic, was an album called Music from Ancient Greece. The problem I learned years later with an album with a title like that, and I didn't have the performers' names, is that there's a lot of albums titled Music from Ancient Greece. And when I eventually bought this CD called Music from Ancient Greece, the Ensemble di Organographia, I thought this was the album that I had heard, and even listening to it musically, I thought this was the Music from Ancient Greece album that I had heard that night. And I recall very, very specifically, it was late night on a summer night, because I believe I had my bedroom window open, and I was actually like leaning on the window, looking out, and actually hearing, you know, the outside sounds. There was nothing to hear. Like I said, it was the dead of night. It was quiet, but apparently it wasn't the incredibly hot, typical summer night that we get in Jersey. It was a bit milder, enough so that you could open the windows and just, you know, breathe in whatever little fresh air would come in, hear a little bit of the outside sounds. Like I said, this is suburbia where nothing was going on, and a quiet street at that. But I remember specifically hearing this and kind of staring out the window in the middle of the night, and this music really has atmosphere to it. I don't know anything about ancient Greece. And eventually when I bought this album, and I thought I had another album, Music from Ancient Greece, as well, that I couldn't find for this, or maybe I just put it in my wish list and I haven't yet purchased it, which may be the case. So I thought this was the album. And but after I bought the album, I found out that it was recorded later. You know, this album that I heard was obviously in the very early 80s. And even though this band was formed, this Ensemble di Organographia, which is it's only a 3 or 4 piece band, and they have made other albums of ancient music of different cultures and times. It looks like there's only 3 members listed here. I thought there were 4. But there's only three people listed here that I could see. The interesting thing with it is, like I was saying, that I learned that this album was recorded. I can't find a recording date on this. I don't want to go by when it was released, but I might have to, because I don't see a recording date. No, I'm not seeing a recording date, but the first copyright date on here is from 1995. Which is obviously a good dozen years or more after I heard the radio broadcast. So I'm guessing that this is not obviously the album that I heard, unless it was re-released. And the 1995 date is when I see a re-release. But usually when you see a re-release, there's a copyright date from the earlier recording or release date, which I am not seeing here. So this little ensemble of 3 or 4 musicians, it looks like it's only 3 here. Don't know why I thought it was 4. Their specialty is recording ancient, pretty much forgotten music, and in a lot of cases, the music wasn't even written down, but they do so much historical research that they approximate what the music would have sounded like, very interestingly enough. So in the case of ancient Greece, I think they had very little to work from in terms of actual songs and what the music sounded like, but they're scholarly and they apparently access other scholars to find any little slight things that they could find that suggest what the music of ancient Greece sounds like. And they do this with other times and cultures too. So they have a series out of at least 3 or 4 albums that I know of on CD that they do this with. They go back and they kind of recreate what they believe the ancient music sounded like, even in the cases where there's no musical notation. Now, in this case, what they did is they had access to advanced diagrams and apparently like historical findings of the actual instruments. So what this ensemble did for this album, and apparently what they actually do for their other albums, I'm trying to focus in here, is these instruments, these are the instruments they use for the recording. A lot of oddball stringed instruments here. They use voice, whether or not you can hear it in the background, there's a female voice singing as well. Some stringed instruments, some flute things that sound like recorders, and a lot of very interesting stringed instruments that you wouldn't have seen before because they don't exist nowadays. They were apparently things that were seen either in diagrams or that were actually like excavated in historical findings, and the group actually created from scratch, based on all this historical knowledge they had, the instruments involved in the playing. So what you see here are the instruments that this group built in order to make this recording. And this is something they obviously take seriously. And then they create music based on what little knowledge they know about the ancient Greece and Greek times and what the music may have sounded like. You know, maybe there's a suggestion of something here and there. And just also, by the way, by the instruments that were discovered, how they work, what their range is, you know, what their pitches are, that kind of thing. Very, very interesting. So they created these instruments before recording the album. A lot of work obviously went into this. This isn't the only time they've done this, because they apparently do this for every single one of these historical ancient music albums that they record. If the instruments don't exist in some form or another, they apparently build them. And if musical notation doesn't exist, they take whatever historical information they could get that gives them an indication of what the music sounded like and create their own music around it. Now, I wouldn't say that this is avant-garde, but this is, I guess, what you could say the earliest world music. The only person that I can think that makes current music that might touch upon something like this is Stefan Mikas, who records for ECM records primarily, because he travels the world, only plays acoustic instruments, and prefers to use ancient instruments and creates this acoustic world of his own. He's not trying to recreate old music, but because he likes to use traditional older instruments, obviously a lot of what he creates is going to sound very similar to the music of the earlier times, of the earlier composers and musicians from that time. So this album, this music of ancient Greece, or in this case it says Greeks, was not the album that I heard that night. But as soon as I bought the CD and I played it, it sure as hell felt the same way. Musically, it sounded very much like what I had recalled, the vibe and atmosphere. It's not a busy, full-sounding album. There's a lot of space there. I don't know the actual recording technique in terms of, I'm thinking that the musicians do use some overdubbing. It's not necessarily just a 2 or 3 man live performance. Some of it may be live. Yeah, 2 males and a female. So the female, I guess, is doing the vocals as well as playing some of the instruments. This is one of those things you can put on when you don't know what you want to listen to, and you don't want something that'll induce a headache or something that's too busy. Certainly, or something. There's no drums of really any type on here. Looking up though, once the internet came around. And once I got this CD and I realized this was not the album that I heard all those years ago, Like I said, though, same vibe. It really sounds the same to me as what my memories of that music were at the time. I did find out that there's quite a handful of music from ancient Greece, whatever, out there, and eventually I'm going to buy them all because I really like it. But it's good when there's audio samples on places like Amazon, though, because the instrumentation sometimes does vary. One of the other albums that I found, music of ancient Greece, is a lot of vocal stuff. This one does not have that much vocal stuff, and the album that I heard does not have a whole ton of vocal stuff way back when. So I don't know if I'll ever find that one that I actually heard, back in the early 80s on that, 2, 3 a.m. morning radio broadcast. But this album certainly sounds like what my memories of that album were. And there's just something real nice about it. I've been saying this a lot lately, maybe. You can read to it. It's good music to read to. Not avant-garde, not difficult, but it doesn't sound anything like, modern music of any type, of jazz, classical, pop, or anything. It really, does sound... probably, if you probably watched movies that took place in ancient Greece, obviously, in a lot of the cases of the movies, they're probably trying to capture a flavor, and they probably are trying to use some of the sounds, if not the specific instruments, of that time. So maybe if you're watching, I don't know, like an old Hercules movie or something, you might, and the music composer was fairly knowledgeable or trying to recreate that era, you might actually hear something that might recall something that like this you would hear on this album. Like I said, not avant-garde, very light, very, sometimes very pretty. Not pretty in a new agey way, but it's really uncluttered music, and music that's, I don't know, a bit like my video that I did on some of the music of, China and Japan, but specifically China, that tends to be very quiet, only a couple instruments, not overly busy. Definitely you can slot a CD in of that kind of music that fits in with this. And I think this ensemble may possibly have even done one possibly of ancient Chinese music. I'm not sure. I'd have to look again. But this is a cool ensemble. I would definitely... I actually already have other albums by them saved into my wish list, and we're definitely interested in picking up more from this ensemble. It's incredible. I don't know what they do besides this, obviously. Maybe they do live performances. They're probably all music professors or teachers or something. Really incredible group of people. So as an ensemble, they're certainly worthwhile. And there are a whole bunch of albums of music of ancient Greece that I also have saved in my wish list even years ago, that I am definitely looking to get into more, to obtain more of. Good quiet stuff. What can I say? It's one of those things you put on when I'm not sure what I want to listen to, because it's not overbearing. And all this is tied together from that particular New York City radio broadcast of that classical music program from all those years ago. That's gone now because station's still around. It's an NPR affiliated station. The New Sounds program is still on that I spoke to earlier. But overnights went to the BBC News for many years. And that's what they've been doing for the last good number of years. They haven't done any kind of classical music for quite a long time now. They have a sister station in New York that's a classical station, but when I put them on, there was more traditional and conservative classical music. It didn't have this whole magical vibe that was around back when I heard these incredible albums. So there's a bit of my personal history. I certainly recommend any of the 4 discs that I showed, with a warning that the Paul Bley and Bill Connors disc, well, even the Columbia Princeton disc, is still pretty experimental, out there stuff. So you have to be prepared for that. Anybody, personally, I think, who's really open to different types of music can appreciate this particular one, this music of ancient Greece, though. It's really, really something, really something. And I still, every time I play it, I still brings back that vibe, that early surrealistic experience that I had. Listening to these things in the dead of night. Okay, I'm going to be doing some update videos, bitching and complaining about my new job, I'm sure. Whatever music I get in there is what I'm going to have to be able to squeeze in during free hours, which I don't know to what extent that's going to be. But I'm still looking. I'm not going to miss anybody's videos, even if it takes me a while to get to actually watch them, and even longer to comment. But I'll be damned if I'm going to miss any of my brothers in the VC, for sure. I'm not going to miss any of that stuff. Okay, guys. This is another overlong one for me, and I didn't intend it on going this long, but I'm not going to be doing, quite as frequently, I guess. I don't know. And if I do manage to knock out a couple videos a week, they'll probably be shorter anyway. So that's what's going on. Hope there's some value in this to you, and happy Sunday night or whatever night you're watching this and you catch it, and hope the new year started off great for everybody, and if not, I hope it just gets better anyway. Okay? Take care, everybody, and I will see you soon.